Welcome to the second panel in today's Reframing Africa program, questions of reframing, measuring the silences. We were very happy today to have a quite international constellation of people whose work in different ways has touched on the kind of space of African filmmaking and the archive in the African continent, but a lot of what the work suggests is that there are many international, transnational connections that define the journeys through these archives. So that it's North Africa and the Arab world, a kind of strange story of a Tanzanian Askari who lives in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and a much more Cold War located narrative around films made under Tito in the former Yugoslavia, in which different African leaders and members of the non-aligned movement make appearances. So we're very happy to have with us Eva Knopf talking about Majub's journey, Mila Turajlic, who's talking about the Labudović, I don't know how to say this exactly, reels and images of African liberation, and Rasha Salti, who is looking at the African and Arab cinema connections during the era of Soviet cultural diplomacy. So I will hand over to Eva to take us into the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina, for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Eva Knopf. I'm from Germany. I'm joining you from Berlin today. And I want to speak about the artistic research that led to my film Majub's Journey that I made a few years back. Majub's Journey is, among other things, the attempt to reconstruct the life of Majub bin Adam Mohammed Hussein. This year is this is one of the few portraits that we have of him. He was born in 1904 in the former colony German East Africa, which was roughly where today's Tanzania is. And in the colony, he fought as a colonial soldier, an Askari, for the Germans in the First World War. He was still a child then, 9 years old. And even though he was a mercenary, he was probably never paid for his services. In 1929, Majub bin Adam Mohammed Hussein came to Germany as a steward on a ship to reclaim his outstanding pay. One can reconstruct this from a memo in the archives of the German Foreign Office. An official noted the claim and at the same time questioned its legitimacy. Majub bin Adam Mohammed Hussein stayed in Germany and renamed himself Mohammed Husen, with Husen being a typical Northern German name. And he arrived in Germany just a few years before Hitler and the Nazis took power. And in the 1930s, he became an extra in the movie business and played along the big German movie stars of the time, such as Sarah Leander, Hans Albers, and Heinz Rühmann. He, of course, played the roles of the servant, the chauffeur, and the elevator boy. In 1942, Mohammed Husen died in a Nazi concentration camp. Who was this man? How did he experience the colony and later Nazi Germany? How was working at the film set for him? Why did he stay in Germany? On first sight, there is not much we have about him. Next to the moving images of him as an extra, and later he even had smaller speaking roles, Mohammed Husen's name appears a few times in the archives of the German Foreign Office, for example, in the memo I just mentioned. But there are no personal letters, no diary entries that have survived. also no relatives or close friends that one can ask today. Many people around him died in the Second World War. So nothing that would allow you to learn more about his subjective views. Is it still possible, though, to write a counter story and tell German history from his perspective? Because Mohammed Hussein was a film extra and I am a filmmaker, I translated this question in Majub's journey into a question of the cinema. And I asked, is it possible to posthumely turn an extra into the star of a film? The movie extra here, this is obvious, is of course a metaphor for the colonized. They don't colonize, they don't appear in history with a capital H, and certainly not in German history. And if so, they do so only at the very margins, in the shadows, not in focus, like a movie extra. I wanted to give this extra his first star role ever. However, the film fragments that I found of him, he often appears so briefly that under normal circumstances, one does not even notice him at all. So the first thing I had to attempt at the editing table was to make him visible at all by, for example, stopping the frame when he briefly walks through. I'll show you a quick example of this. Here he's playing a servant in a movie with Sarah Leander. And then, of course, there was a huge dilemma I faced as a filmmaker. It is exceptional that we have moving images of a Black German from the 1930s, images that allow to make him phenomenologically come to life again in the sense of the cinema. And in this way, these images are very precious. However, they're also often racist in their representation. Mohammed Hussein is often not only served in serving roles, like we've just seen, but often straightforwardly degrading ones. As a filmmaker, do I show these images or not? Showing them also means repeating the racist stereotypes. Not showing them would have meant to forget Mohammed Hussein in the archives, or at least of refraining from reinscribing him into history and film history. For me, as a white filmmaker working within European institutions, I found the following answer. I often showed the images of him twice. One time, largely as they appear in the historical films, to also show how the archive is constituted, in a way reading the archive with its grain. And then I reframed them. I zoomed in, I slowed down, I paused, I accompanied them by music in order to recreate images that make Mohammed Hussein visible in a new way, and in the best case, lift him out of the ideological framework of the historical narrative. Such an approach, of course, does not solve the dilemma of these images. It's just one attempt to deal with them from within my position within Western institutions. And to an extent, dealing with these images was a research at the editing table, thinking at the editing table, whereby editing table, of course, was my computer and digital editing software. And the question always was, what other images are there in the material beyond the immediate ones? What kind of access has the colonial archive produced? What escaped the colonial gaze? Where are these images, where there are there maybe even resistant images? Is an extra falling out of his role somewhere maybe? And by saying this, it also becomes clear that reading images against their grain, moving images, requires completely different procedures and leads to different results than, for example, reading written documents against their grain. Now, I have to remember to breathe. I'll get out of breath. I want to show you something quickly. The only document Mohammed Hussein has left that can himself, that it did not come to me through the official archives, but through a former neighbor of him in Berlin. It is a blank sheet of writing paper, a story not written, a voice not heard. But the letter is not fully empty. There is a big letterhead. Where's the big letterhead? Oh, it's not here. I have to, the image is missing. On it, there is a lion, an Askari soldier, and a flag. And I will come back to that one in a second, because also during my research, I heard of a colonial monument that I wanted to. I lost my pages here. I heard of a particular colonial monument that was supposed to be laying in the Hamburg Observatory. And during my research, I went to check it out because I knew that Mohammed Hussein must have known it. And the moment I opened the door to the shed where it was laying, I knew how to make the film. And I show you again, this is what I saw. There was this monument taken down, laying in this shed. And when it was still erected, it looked like this, a typical colonial monument with the colonial ruler Hermann von Wissmann below his feet, an anonymous colonial soldier looking up to him, and in front of the soldier, a dead lion covered with the colonial flag. And I knew these figures. I knew these figures from Mohammed Hussein's letterhead. He had rearranged them. The lion was not dead, but roaring. He was not looking up, but straight ahead, holding a gun, and the flag was blowing in the wind. And a German in a tropical uniform was not to be seen at all. So he had rearranged the figures and had left out the colonial ruler entirely. And in Majub's journey, this at least is my artistic fantasy, I take up and continue Mohammed Hussein's artistic practice of rearranging and reordering the figures, and that thus, of course, also the colonial order. And by rearranging the monument in different ways, I produce different kinds of images along which I tell the story in the film. To begin with, we took the monument out of the shed and re-erected it, but instead of putting the colonial ruler on a pedestal, we hung him. Now, two things I want to quickly say before I end. Yes. So, excuse me?
I'm just saying, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, just one more minute. One thing that, even though there's very little in the archives about Mohammed Hussein, one can only reconstruct his life in the way that was possible after all, because he himself inscribed himself in the archive in different ways. He became an extra and an artist, and there's some more documents. He continuously wrote to the Foreign Office with different claims, like his outstanding pay, and only because he took these kinds of actions, there are these traces of him in the official German archives. And also, I think this project is about the idea that where history proper, like academic historiography, cannot exercise its tools anymore because there are no materials, then other practices must come into play and tell the stories of these gaps. For example, the kind of artistic research I did with the images of the cinema. And in the program of this conference, there's a link to watch the film if you're interested. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and we'll have some time to take questions and talk more about the film later. And I'd also meant to remind everybody that if you look on your emails and your program, there are links to the websites of all of the panelists on today's panel. So really interesting material available there for you to engage with, and definitely watch the film. Eva's film is very interesting. All right, and so we will hand over to Mila now to hear more about the Cold War period.
Thank you, Bettina. So it's really wonderful to be part of this panel because we get to do these comparisons across, like you said, transnational lines. And I have prepared something, but I was really inspired by this morning's panel, and I kind of decided to speak off the cuff and kind of hoping that it will spark a really interesting conversation in the end. But just to give an introduction, so I'm speaking to you from Belgrade, which is the capital of Serbia, but when I was born was still the capital of Yugoslavia. And socialist Yugoslavia, which existed between 1945 and the 1990s, inscribes itself into the story of cinema in Africa and African cinema in a very unexpected way. And it's unexpected because Yugoslavia has been written out of my own country's history due to a very violent erasure of public memory and a new nationalistic narrative that followed this decade of civil war. And its disappearance from the political map of the world also meant that Yugoslavia was written out of the Cold War histories because it doesn't actually fit into them. Simply because following 1948 and the Yugoslavia's ejection from the Soviet bloc, it became a non-aligned country in a divided Europe. So it actually doesn't fit elegantly into any Cold War analysis. And then while some recent examinations of transnational collaborations have begun to take off this Cold War lens, and it's something that I'm very much trying to do, and examine independent struggles from a different perspective, Yugoslavia's own anti-fascist struggle has been framed out of that analysis. And so finally, I think another reason this is such an unexpected and unknown story is that this form of Yugoslav cultural diplomacy, namely its participation in African filmmaking, was a clandestine affair at its inception, and then intermittent and uncredited throughout the whole 60s and the 70s. So just to give a little bit of historical context, part of my work has really been to reframe this story away from Cold War narratives, simply because, like I said, simply due to the disappearance of the country, people tend to see Yugoslavia as a Soviet satellite country, which it absolutely wasn't from 1948 onwards. And being the host of the first non-aligned summit in Belgrade in 1961, it really was perceived by countries that were emerging in Africa and Asia as a country that had done two things. One was its own anti-fascist, which is to say independence struggle during the Second World War, and two, having charted its own path towards its own form of socialism in the 1950s and 1960s. And so I think it's really important at the beginning of this story, just to have in our minds how Yugoslavia and Yugoslavia's leader, Josip Broz Tito, was perceived at the time by newly emerging countries in Africa and in Asia. And these two specificities of Yugoslavia actually meant that the ways it began to collaborate with firstly independence movements and then with newly emerging countries was that the forms of technical aid that it provided to these countries, particularly during the late 1950s and 1960s, was that it was non-conditional aid, which is to say it wasn't tied to any ideological requirements of demands by the Yugoslav government. And not only was it non-conditional, it was also uncredited. They didn't insist on their participation in being credited in any or advertised in any way, which is one of the reasons nobody knows about it today. So I have provided a website link for the research project and the documentary film that I've been working on for the past 5 years. And the project really deals with an archive that is absolutely, someone referred this morning to a neglected archive, and it's absolutely a neglected archive and very much a forgotten one, which is an archive of filmed materials made by Yugoslav cameramen employed at the Yugoslav newsreels from the 1950s to the end of the 1980s. The Yugoslav newsreels were the only film production studio in Yugoslavia that were directly answerable to the federal government, meaning that they were an instrument of political aid by Yugoslavia in their kind of foreign diplomacy and their cultural diplomacy. And this archive, I've linked on the website, I've kind of given a very brief history of what the archive is, but this archive was shaped by the fact that, as I said, the Non-Aligned Summit was held for the first time in Belgrade in 1961. And from that moment on, Yugoslav cameramen were filming all of the non-aligned summits that took place up until the last Cold War non-aligned summit, which was the 1989 summit in Belgrade again. And what I've been trying to do with these archival materials is really resurrect that knowledge of these kind of collaborations that have been forgotten and resurrect those images simply because they've never been worked on and digitized. And ultimately, I think what drives me as a filmmaker is to resurrect that understanding that used to exist between Yugoslavia and countries in Africa and Asia. And the first step in this research project has been to make a documentary film about the cameraman of the Yugoslav newsreels who perhaps is the kind of embodiment of the spirit of what the Yugoslav cameramen were doing at the time. So his name is Stevan Labudović. And from 1954, he was assigned to follow and travel with the Yugoslav president Tito. What is really extraordinary is that his assignment marks the beginning of a very unusual period of diplomacy that was really led by Tito himself, who having found himself kind of ejected from the communist bloc and very much adrift diplomatically, belonging neither to the West or to the East, began to travel by ship to Africa and Asia in the hope of building new friendships or building new alliances. And so from 1954, when he traveled by ship to Burma and India, 1956, he traveled to Ethiopia and Egypt, or the UAR as it was called at the time. In 1959, they traveled for 93 days by ship all the way to Burma, Indonesia, Ceylon at the time, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Stevan Labudović, as Tito's cameraman, was responsible for filming not only the official ceremonies and the protocols surrounding Tito's visits to these countries, but also trying to make portraits on the fly of these countries as they were emerging and presenting themselves to these foreign visitors. And these kinds of cinematic journeys constitute a really interesting aspect of this filmed archive because they help us read how national identities are being formed through gestures of presentation and protocol, but also through the ways that these events are being mediated through these newsreels. A second stage in Labudović's career, and the one that is kind of really marked his life and destiny, is the fact that from the 1950s, Tito had been approached by liberation movements in Africa, again, being seen as the person who had successfully led his own independence movement in the Second World War, to provide tactical advice, strategic knowledge, and also specific military aid to these movements. And when you look at the archival documents that surround these conversations that start taking place between the Yugoslav government and liberation movements, what you find really interesting is that they decided to bring support to some of these liberation movements without really making any kind of value judgments concerning the ideologies of these movements. And so when they were contacted by the Algerian Liberation Front in 1959, Tito agreed to send them weapons and uniforms, but he pronounced himself saying, what you really need are images. What you need in order to fight a media war is images that show your own struggle. And as a result, Stevan Labudović was sent to film for the Algerian Liberation Movement, which is a mission he accomplished for about 3 years and up until the independence of Algeria. And as a result, he shot about 83 kilometers of 35mm film, it's really important to say, which were sent back to Belgrade, developed in the laboratory in Belgrade, and then edited into newsreels sent around the world, distributed, and also edited into films for the Algerian liberation movement. And so for me, Stevan Labudovic's story really begins there as this kind of vector of political support and solidarity via filmmaking. His mission did not end there. After Algeria, he was sent to film various other liberation movements, and along with other cameramen of the Yugoslav newsreels, they ended up making the first documentary film for Limo in Mozambique. They ended up instructing cameramen in Mali and Tanzania in the creation of those countries' first newsreels upon their independence. And in the early 1970s, he went to make a documentary film with Yasser Arafat about the PLO. So it's a kind of body of work spanning more than almost 3 decades, which in itself I find as an object of research incredibly interesting as a vector of these transnational collaborations. And the reason that I began this research project with a documentary about him is that I find it very curious somehow to observe the work of historians. And Eva just refers to what happens when historiography cannot exercise its work. And I find that historiography tends to use these audiovisual images as proof and kind of reading the moving image for its indexical value. But for me as a filmmaker myself and as a cameraman myself, when I work with filmed images, I see them as vectors of intention, of attempts, mistakes, frustrations, successes and failures. And so for me, I was interested in beginning the work, the reflection on this archive by collaborating with the person who filmed it, because I found him a way to start untangling these questions of authorship and subjectivity of the images. And I felt that that would perhaps be the most useful way to begin reframing that archive and understanding its creation. And ultimately, the project goes on because the idea is to use this archive to reframe the narrative of Yugoslav identity, and particularly Yugoslavia's relationship with its non-aligned colleagues, and the legacy of these film collaborations, which very much inscribes itself into this theory of third cinema, which is something that is, I think, beginning to kind of regain interest and traction, how these collaborative practices of filmmaking were used as kind of political instruments in a global media war that was furthering the cause of African independence. And so I've put the trailer for the film on the website. The film is in editing right now. So what you're seeing actually is the trailer is what we call a pitching trailer, which is a trailer that we were using for fundraising purposes. So obviously it's not for public circulation, but it gives an introduction into the character. It gives a kind of taste of the archives that we're working with. And hopefully with the film being completed by the end of this year, we'll be able to present it next year, which kind of ties into a series of events around the anniversary of the Belgrade summit, because in September 2021, it will obviously be 60 years since the first non-aligned summit in Belgrade. And I'd like to say something a little bit about, obviously, the fact that working on this film has kind of brought me to reflect on my own engagement with Stevan's work. Because obviously his work resonated with me both personally and ideologically, and it kind of helped me understand how my own Yugoslav subjectivity is actually affecting my reading of the images. Because as I said at the very beginning, I was born when Belgrade was still the capital of Yugoslavia. So it's for me, it's very much been a project that has brought back to me my own subjectivities, which are very Yugoslav, effectively. And so the process of the work has been filming with him. I filmed with him for a period of over 3 years, and I ended up filming around 120 hours of footage with him, traveling with him to Algeria, as well as to locations in the former Yugoslavia that were essential to the story. But then also kind of seeking out other forms of archive that could supplement the story. So institutional paper documents and private archives. And it's really the private archives, the letters, the diaries, the telegrams, the notes, the scripts, which have helped me understand the complexity of this work is on a very kind of micro level. And this is where I see the importance of trying to activate that archive in this particular way. And then just finally to say that I have sought out secondary characters for the film as a way of supplanting that story. So I have worked with people who were involved in the ALN cinema department who helped me understand from their perspective what the support in images has been. But also an integral part of working on this project for me has been this form of collaboration, which is to say workshopping it. And so interestingly enough, both Rasha, who is on this panel, but also Mila Turajlic, who's on the next panel, have kind of actively been helping me think through this material in understanding the consideration that it solicits and the conversations that this material sparks. Because this archive as a body is a site of memory. And for me, it's very much been a process of trying to understand what we can excavate from that, what kind of media archaeology we can perform on that site. And I guess finally, just to address one of what seems to me one of the central themes of this workshop, which is the question of accessing this archive. And for me, it's been a very tricky and difficult process to negotiate, because obviously there are more material, political, and diplomatic issues connected to working in this archive. The material one being that they are not primarily a research institution at all. They're a production studio. And so being able to just logistically figure out ways that I can spend the time needed in order to work with this material, obviously none of it's been digitized. So to be able to view it, select from it, return and watch the unedited material, the material that has never been screened. The unused footage has been one incredibly time-consuming and challenging part of the process, but there are two other issues which are also at stake. One is a political one, and the second is a diplomatic one. The political one is that obviously the current Serbian government doesn't really, to my mind, recognize the value of this archive. And so, like I said at the beginning, because it doesn't fit into the current nationalistic narrative of the country, it doesn't fit into any of the exercises of public memory that are taking place in Serbia right now. So it has absolutely been neglected for that reason. And then diplomatically, it opens up a whole host of questions of ownership, because these images were obviously filmed for countries in Africa, but at the expense of the Yugoslav government at the time, have been preserved in Belgrade, and all sorts of, it opens up all hosts of issues concerning their legal status right now. And maybe I stop there because I see that the time is up, but hopefully that's, open enough points for discussion.
That was really wonderful. You managed to fit in a lot of really provocative and compelling thoughts and complexities in that short time. So thanks very much. I don't want to delay and hand over to Rasha now to tell us a little bit more about what Bruce Lee has to do with Soviet cinema.
Yeah. Well, I would like to begin by thanking everyone for this invitation, everyone who's been involved, Pervaiz, but also Abu Bakr, for this lovely invitation. And I really wish I was in Johannesburg right now and not in Leipzig. And I would also like to say that this project, Saving Bruce Lee, was co-curated with Koyo Kuo, who is today the director of the Zuid-Smoka Museum in Cape Town, that just opened a brilliant exhibition. I have images. They're not random, but it doesn't really matter how they flow. I will indicate to the lovely team when to move to the next image, but it's not like science. It's just to show you a bit what we've done. I also posted the little booklet that was produced. You can download it because it's out of print. So picking up is actually quite perfect, picking up after Mila's wonderful presentation. Because we go to the Soviet Union, we go to Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Empire, with Saving Bruce Lee. During the bipolarism of the Cold War, the African continent and the Arab world were contested territories for the strategic deployment of influence and allegiance between the two superpowers. Cultural diplomacy represented an important realm in which that contest was manifested, specifically with the disbursement of scholarships in higher education and the creation of specialized professional national elites whose allegiance would be organically bound to either power. Under the aegis of the international socialist friendships, i.e. countries where the ruling political force had socialist and communist affiliations, or where communist parties were powerful, the Soviet Union used channels of diplomacy to host a remarkable number of students at universities in Moscow and in other cities of the Soviet bloc. Saving Bruce Lee explored this rarely examined versant in film history, namely researching the destinies of some African and Arab filmmakers who studied at the Gerasimov Institute of Cinematography, or VGIC, school in Moscow. Given the paucity of primary resources, the impetus was to retrace the journeys of several filmmakers by recording, when possible, their testimonies and recollections, bringing to light elements that help trace tangibly and critically the influence of Soviet masters on their students' practice and hopefully compel interrogations of prevailing scholarships on Africa and Arab cinema, on African and Arab cinema. The mentors at the VGIC were successful and practicing Soviet filmmakers. Some were as famous as Grigory Shukrai and Roman Karmen, and others well-known, although award-winning, less well-known, although award-winning internationally, like Igor Talankin and Marlen Khutsiev. It is furthermore remarkable that Soviet film histories and theories have omitted entirely the foreign graduates from narratives of canons of Soviet history. Some of the most critically acclaimed and internationally recognized filmmakers in Africa and in the Arab world are graduates of the VGIC. I will name a few: Suleiman Sissé from Mali, Abdelrahman Sissako, Mauritania, Mali, Osama Mohammed, Syria, Azzeddin Madour, Algeria. Others are less well known, but are now becoming visible. Suleiman Brahim al-Nour, Nasser Tayyib al-Mak, Muhammad Abu al-Wakar, Rabah Boubarras, Abdoulaye Ascofare, and others. The project was initially an invitation from the Garage Museum in Moscow. Koyo and I were asked to curate an exhibition based on our research. Halfway through, after we conducted several research trips in Moscow and St. Petersburg, consulted archives and interviewed several people, the project fell through for reasons that are not really interesting to recount or to go over now, but in essence, we were ill-equipped to access the archives that really mattered to us, namely the VGIC's archives, the student files, the curricula, and the student films. In 2018, in the framework of their vast program entitled Interrogating the Canon, we were invited to present the research as a conference and film screening program at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin, HKW. Access to the archives changed drastically after Gabriel Chomentowski, a French scholar and academic, became an active participant in our program. The program that we eventually presented had to be narrowed down in scope, but we maintained some of the key conceptual elements of our project and curatorial endeavor. We were really focused on the question of transmission of memory, lived experience, poetics, and aesthetics. The time frame of the research is bracketed between the beginning of the 1960s and the end of the 1980s. You can start showing images 1, and then 2, and then 3. We recovered to the extent possible the institutional and documentary archives, we recovered to the extent possible the institutional documentary traces of the passages of the students in Moscow and in the USSR. You can show image 4. The aim was to bring center stage a cinematic language and legacy that had received little attention in prevailing scholarship on film history. You can show images 5 and 6. We began with trying to understand the underpinnings of the Cold War's cultural diplomacy and its deployment of power and ideological conquest through the formation of elites. Images 7 and 8. We identified a number of Arab filmmakers to become the main protagonist of our research. Basically, the areas, image 9. The 3 main areas of our research were, firstly, documents from the institutional archives of the VGIC and the Patrice Lumumba University to understand the mechanics of pedagogy in the Soviet framework. Image 10. and how socialism's promises of utopia and clearly defined ideological framework intersected with a cinematic imaginary and the filmmaker's subjective voices. You can scroll image 10 and 11. Considering some of the filmmakers who graduated from the VGIK went back to their countries and were considered dissident, critical artists, we also wanted to trace subversion and criticality and its relationship to the curriculum and respective practice of Soviet mentors. Image 11. Secondly, we recorded whenever accessible the testimony of these protagonists in their years, on their years in Moscow. Image 11. On the one hand, the experience of learning was recalled with a great deal of enthusiasm, while on the other hand, social life was marked with alienation, racism, and ostracization. Image 12. They had very few Russian friends and kept together. The students at the VGIK closest to them from the Soviet world were the Armenians, the Georgians, i.e. the non-Russians. Image 12. Thirdly, we collected documents from the press and archives of film festivals in the USSR where their films were screened, or at least where their presence in the public/cultural sphere was obviously manifest. Image 13. Those were mostly at the Tashkent Film Festival and to a lesser extent at the Moscow Film Festival. In the document I shared, Elena Razlogova's text recounts the incredible experience of the film's translators. There was no subtitling at those festivals at the time. It was live dubbing. The dialogue was translated through live dubbing. Image 14 and then image 15. Going back to the question of pedagogy and transmission of cinematic poetics, because what is clear is that the VGIK did not train Soviet propagandists. As a matter of fact, some of the graduates we identified are known to have had a notably subjective artistic practice and cinematic voice, and even paid a price for defending a subversive position in their own country or more generally. Conversely, looking closer at their Soviet mentors, they too were not propagandists, but rather artists and filmmakers whose subjective voices were not immune to repression by the authorities. Some of their films were banned. They were critical voices from within the system and a society who seemed to have transmitted to their students an epistemology or an aesthetics of subversion. In fact, they were forced to teach, or they were pushed to teach, to make fewer films, to have less time to make films. The project's time span is a historical bracket marked with upheaval in both the African continent and the Arab world, beginning with independence and the arduous challenge of decolonization, followed by coups d'etats in the 1970s and 1980s that were sometimes mired in the eruption of violent strife, but almost invariably the tightening of self-proclaimed democracies or republics into autocracies governed by an iron fist that policed freedom of expression, political dissent, and civil liberties. Reversely, in the Soviet Union, the 1960s were marked by Khrushchev's policy of thaw, or the political liberalization following the dark decades of Stalin's rule. However, that policy was short-lived, and intolerance for dissent or deviance from the party line soon returned to prevail until perestroika and glasnost. In other words, it is impossible to synthesize a single overarching narrative when trying to deconstruct cinematic idiom, political engagement, and the personal experience of these filmmakers. The changing context impacted their destinies and should be acknowledged. The destiny of the first generation of students who enrolled in the 1960s was radically different from those who enrolled in the 1970s and 80s. They were all motivated to build or contribute to their national cinemas, respectively. The first generation who returned home in the 60s had to practically lay the building blocks for creating public film production entities. The second generation returned home to face harsh realities, a terrible paucity of means for production, but also unsympathetic regimes. The situation was worse for the third generation. Hamad Malas directed His first feature, Dreams of the City, in 1984, several years after he returned to Syria, because the state produced up to 1.5 film features per year. And while the film earned critical praise worldwide, it was frowned upon by Syrian authorities. Usama Muhammad's first feature, Stars in Broad Daylight, which he also directed several years after he returned, premiered in Cannes, but was banned in Syria. The print of Ibrahim Sulaiman and Noor's Africa was destroyed after the military coup d'etat in Sudan. We found the film in Moscow, and the film has now been restored by the Arsenal in Berlin. Needless to describe Abdelrahman Sissako's Waiting for Happiness, the criticality of that film, or Bamako, which remains one of the most scathing and eloquent critiques of the World Bank's policy in Mali and in Africa. I just quickly conclude with Saving Bruce Lee. In other words, the protagonists of their films are everyday folk who are heroic in their tenacity to defy adversity, stand for their rights, and fight for a modicum of life with dignity. Their protagonists never wanted to sit on the throne that eventually Bruce Lee claimed. Saving Bruce Lee owes its enigmatic title to an anecdote told by Ivoirian filmmaker Philippe Lacote, who presented his first film run at the Cannes Film Festival. Lacote was recounting the moment when he became fascinated with cinema as a teenager, watching a Bruce Lee film in a theater in Abidjan. In one scene, Bruce Lee, surrounded by enemies, was vanquishing them one by one, but suddenly, unbeknownst to him, a man creeping out of his sight was waiting for the right moment to attack him. And when he did, a spectator leapt from his seat, carrying a knife, tore the screen, screaming at Bruce Lee that he would save him. At that moment, the young Philippe Lacote understood the power of film. The anecdote fascinated us for several reasons, chief among them the panoply of cinematic heroes that people the cultural imaginaries in the African continent and the Arab world. Since the middle of the 1970s, Bruce Lee has reigned as an uncontested, beloved, and admired icon. With his physical prowess and sense of justice, he captivated at once the imaginary of the rich and poor, the upright and the wayward, the powerful and the disenfranchised. Perhaps he was the first global hero, the king with the longest rule before Bollywood action films or overran the distribution market. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasha. Wonderful. Amazing synoptic history that you managed to fit in there. It was incredible. I was trying to keep up and take notes, but and I hated to stop you all because I think I would have liked you to all carry on speaking. But now we have a bit of time for a conversation between us and to take some questions that are coming in. We have about 23 minutes for a discussion, which is really nice. I think it would be interesting, perhaps I could ask some things or summarize some things that came up for me. There was the sense of the neglected archive, which comes also from the morning's conversation into ours, and archives with gaps in them, archives where you cannot find the figure that you're looking for, the experience you had with Koyo of not being able to access the archives and then them opening up. Mila's kind of experience of also a very neglected archive, but an attempt, I guess, to resurrect this archive by digitization. And then to also, I think, interestingly subjectivize this account through both your own subjectivity, Mila, but also that of the director, so that this sort of subjective and artistic methodologies that Eva also employed, where we re-enter, re-inscribe rather, and gesture to the archive, I guess by doing things that disrupt it in some sense, by reversing it, by slowing it down, and by kind of making the seemingly extra characters into the main characters. It's something really interesting. I think that happens in Mila's film with this director who plays such a massive role in kind of representing, I guess, images of an emerging independent set of nations on the African continent and other spaces. So in a sense, I mean, and there's a kind of, I think the question for me was also how we, I guess, map or think about this kind of national and transnational tension in the different projects, and where the the kind of narrative that's been so strongly written, for example, in the kind of Serbian post-Yugoslavian narrative that has written out the existence of Yugoslavia to some extent, both from a Cold War perspective and from a nationalist contemporary perspective. This is really interesting to me, whereas in other kinds of projects, a kind of transnational image of the African continent emerges, where different territories like Sudan or Uganda are connected, or via the Soviet training of Solomon Sise, not Uganda, but more the kind of West African context, training in the USSR and coming back to make films in their own countries. So something really interesting there about the usefulness of national and transnational and kind of where they undo each other in some way. So maybe we start with that question.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very short answer. I mean, the archives are really difficult to access unless one has really established trust with institutions in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I let Mila talk more about archives because I think it's, I've heard her before and it's fascinating. And just to, I think the segue between what I saving or what I kept from the project, Eva's project, and actually the motivation of the cameraman in Yugoslavia. When I was on stage with Usama Muhammad, I asked him very simply, what have you kept from Igor Talankin? What stays with you? And he told me that Talankin explained to him that cinema is the relationship between justice and beauty. And I think I think that's something in the socialist utopia that maybe stays. And you can see it in Suleiman Sise, in Sisako, in a lot of the Soviet cinema, in a lot of the Yugoslav cinema, actually, the subversive Yugoslav filmmakers. And I think it's what Eva tried to do.
Very interesting. Mila, perhaps you could take that up. There are some questions from the audience. Do you want to respond first to Rasha and maybe this question of the kind of national and transnational?
The first thing I feel like I need to do is clarify that Labudović was not a director. He is a cameraman, and this is incredibly important because it raises all sorts of questions of authorship. When you look at the films that were edited using his material, he's never signed as the director. The directors are, the people who are signed as directors are people who are never in the field. And what I've been working on a lot is going through the state archives of the Yugoslav Ministry, of the old Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of the cabinet of the President of the Republic, to try and understand who is actually writing these scripts. How is this political influence being filtered down into the filmmaking? Because when he goes into the field, he's working on the basis of a script that was written for him. And then when I look at his diaries, I begin to understand how little of what was written for him he could execute or wanted to execute or felt was right. And that's when he begins to negotiate. So there isn't authorship there because there is a reflectivity in his work. There's a subjectivity in his work. And I find it incredibly interesting to observe how he negotiated that as being the person who's actually in the field capturing the footage. So that was just to clarify, because he's not a director and he never described himself as one. But going back to the archive, where Rasha is absolutely right is that all of this hinges on personal trust, which is built over years. And I'm fully mindful of the fact that if it weren't for him, and the fact that I'm working on a film about him using his footage, it would probably have been impossible for me to work with the unedited footage that he shot. This has just been... I happened to arrive, I think, at a moment in his life where he was willing to open those doors for me. And I'm incredibly respectful and mindful of the fact that, it's kind of an incredible opportunity. And it is only because he is, in that sense, the author of the footage, that I'm able to also negotiate what I described earlier, these political and legal and diplomatic questions concerning this footage, because it really is in a state of limbo, but it's in a state of limbo for many reasons. One of which is the breakup of Yugoslavia and the unresolved succession issues concerning Yugoslav archives. And then a second, obviously, is the political situation in Serbia right now. And the third, obviously, being, as I mentioned, kind of the diplomatic tensions inherent in material that has been filmed by one country for another and never really fully legally resolved, which I think answers one of the questions that was posed in the chat concerning what sort of collaborations. It's really hard to say. What I've dedicated my work to in the last 3 years is making this archive known.
Should I read the question quick?
Sure.
Oh yeah, this is read it. So we had a question about what sort of collaborations could one establish with archive activists in the African countries to preserve and share these images?
So the images are preserved in the sense that this archive is in a pretty decent condition, and the people who work on it and with it are the newsreels just joined FIAF, is the International Archive Federation. So, it's been a long path of trying to bring up the standards because they're a very poorly funded institution, a cultural institution of the Serbian government, but possibly the one that receives the least amount of funding from the Ministry of Culture. But just to say, they're not crumbling. These are archives that are in, decent atmospheric temperature conditions. They're simply not the object of research right now, because for reasons I explained in my presentation. But what sort of collaborations? Well, that's kind of been the challenge for me in the last couple of years. So the work that I've focused on is, one, making this archive known, two, contextualizing it, because I would hate for this material to become kind of stock footage for commercial productions, and then kind of narrative of, the narratives of kind of commercially well-funded documentary projects. I really cared about not the images being contextualized in the context of their creation, how these collaborations came to being, and what these images are really vectors of, this kind of solidarity and so on. And from that point on, one thing that I've been trying to do is figure out ways to make these images travel, not just within the scope of making one documentary film about the person who shot them, but really to make them travel via exhibitions, via some kind of presentations, public partnerships, and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, there have been a few questions. I'll sum them up from Abu Bakr, again, about accessibility to students interested in non-alignment and so on. And I think those are kind of answered a bit in your in what you've said. I wanted to go to Cynthia's question to Rasha, and then maybe bring that back to Eva at some point. But the question is, have you found out how the critical Soviet mentors passed on dissidence to their students? Was it through a philosophical epistemic attitude, or particular practices? I guess it's a question of transmission somehow, again, of ideology and cinematic praxis and aesthetics. And I wondered if Eva could also come in on that question after you, Rasha, to talk to the strange position of this figure from Tanzania, this Askari man who ends up in Nazi Germany and aligns himself with the strange neo-colonial movement of that period. I'm curious about these other transmissions of ideology in the aesthetics of the statue, in his kind of strange logo as well. Thanks.
I want to preface, Saving Bruce Lee is not the only project that looked into this transmission of practice. There is a beautiful project that was undertaken by an organization called Transit in Bratislava that basically explored the history of the FAMU school in Prague, and the sort of third world or international graduates. And there's currently a project undertaken by the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, looking at the graduates of the school in Łódź. I think criticality was transmitted through various means. Through, if you look at the curricula, I mean, they were studying economics, they were studying atheism, because it was the Soviet Union, but they were studying the history of art, and they were reading Marx. And the mentors were the penultimate reference for the 4 or 5 years that the students were at the school. And I think there was a lot of there was a big intimacy between the filmmakers and the mentors. And the fondest memories from everybody that we interviewed was the relationship to the mentor. Otherwise, they had scant contact with other people in Russian society. In Soviet cinema, the supreme dissident, subversive filmmaker is considered to be Andrei Tarkovsky. Andrei Tarkovsky never taught. he was barely accessible to those people. Igor Talankin, who had several films banned, was there for the students. Marlene Khutsiev never had any easy time making films, and even had a couple of films banned, was also the transmitter of the craft. They remember when we, of course, we asked them all about Tarkovsky. They remember going to Gosfilmofond, watching Tarkovsky's new film before it went to Venice or Cannes, but that was it. So there is this necessity of rethinking the canon and writing those people into Soviet. What we don't know is what they gave to their Soviet students and teachers, what they taught them, what they left them with. But we know that what they brought back was this incredible sense of justice and commitment to justice.
That's very interesting. It'd be nice to hear from Eva.
Yeah, I just want to quickly speak about Mohammed Hussen's kind of role in, or his public role in Germany. Well, one has to remember that he was a child soldier for the Germans. His father was also a soldier for the Germans and died in the First World War. And then Germans had to give the colony to the Brits, and well, then eventually Mohammed Hussen came to Germany. So there wasn't really, I don't think, as an Askari, having fought for the Germans, it was probably not kind of the best place to be in the British colony then, for one to be. And then in Germany, if you think of it kind of in the language of the cinema, the role that was offered to Mohammed Hussen was the role of the faithful Askari. That was kind of the German, what's the English, like the military leaders who had fought in the former colony. They kind of, when there were public public events, they like to have him by their side as like a live specimen of the faithful Askari. And this is also in the film. I play with the statue and Mohammed Hussen, that the Germans really wanted the bronze statue more than the live Mohammed Hussen, because he exceeded this role constantly, like writing to the Foreign Office, asking for a war medal, that was only meant for white soldiers, and they really didn't know what to do with this request, for example. And then he had a German wife and had children with several other German women. And he was not, in his public persona, he was playing the role that was offered to him in this neo-colonial movement. Also, it was like his childhood, everything he knew kind of from his childhood was being a soldier. But then he spilled kind of over this role, which also led to his end, while he was interred in a concentration camp because of one-to-many affairs. And so he wasn't like the Nazis wanted him as this faithful Askari, but he also wasn't, and this for me was interesting as a filmmaker, he was also not like I might have wanted him, this revolutionary anti-colonial freedom fighter, but he was very much kind of figuring out kind of his way, playing with the roles that were offered by him by society. And so, and as a kind of script writer and film director, I think this is it's a wonderful character that you cannot pin down easily and put him in into this Schablone, what is that, like framework or that framework. But until the end, you really he keeps slipping kind of away.
There are some questions from Abu Bakr and others just around new linkages between African cinema and Soviet cinema of the same period of, and if VGIK was home of the Cine Rebels, have you looked into this? Another question from Abu Bakr about African filmmakers African films post-produced in Russia, and if you have know anything more about that work, and a question about the access to films outside of the newsreel, so fiction, I guess, or other kinds of documentaries, such as The Time of Leopards shot in Mozambique. So those questions, I wonder if we have 10 more minutes. Those are kind of questions quite directly about the archives. So I wonder if we could come back to those. I wanted to ask a question about representation and gender, if that's okay, to kind of keep with the question of this figure in your film, Eva, and the kind of central figure in your kind of film, who's the cameraman who's become the author through your kind of engagement with him in your film Mila. And I guess the figure of Bruce Lee and the kinds of directors who we're hearing speaking in the work in the Bruce Lee project, they're mostly men. And so the kind of, it's a very strongly masculine subjectivity who authors this space in some sense, and also travels this national and transnational kind of division in a way, not without like massive consequences in some cases, as you've said, for the directors. And the story of your film, Eva, is a really tragic one. I mean, a kind of a figure, and I was a figure of really the tragedy of that period. But I think what I'm interested in is how you as filmmakers, I don't know if you identify as women, but I mean, largely as women filmmakers, and I guess myself in my own work, how we re-enter these archives and reinscribe these masculinities in some way, and what the role of fiction is in that.
I'll answer quickly. I love your question, Bettina. To answer Abu Bakr quickly, we did not look into films that were post-produced in Russia. I mean, I didn't really want to get into this, but it was really very, very hard for us to access the archives. And in the end, we had to go through very circuitous ways. I could not disclose the names of whoever provided us in the end with the films. And the mistrust was on many levels. So we did not look into that in the post-production. The answer, most of the applicants to the VGIK were men. I think almost all. And even in the classrooms, you find very few women. I think the applicants from the so-called third world countries, women were encouraged to apply to get diplomas in pharmacy, not in filmmaking, basically in jobs that secured careers, but not in filmmaking. So it was very much a man's world and very much stories of men. However, I mean, part of the subversion in those films that they made are stories of broken masculinities. So not only they were, in Sissako or in Usama Muhammad's film, Stars in Broad Daylight, it's just an examination of a scathing critique of patriarchy, of violence, and of how men break women and become broken in the process. So yeah, the absence of women is astounding.
Mila, if you don't want to, I can just quickly say this may not directly answer your question, but what I found curious during my research, that it seemed to be only like the white German women that engaged with Mohammed Hussein outside of his like kind of military or movie career. Like he was married, he had children with at least two different women, more affairs that we know of, and that kind of this, that they would engage with them on a personal level like this. I don't know how this is mirrored in my engagement with the archival material, but to the and to speak to the kind of how the African man is represented in these films, there was also a curious shift in German cinema. In the 1920s, still the African man had a kind of diabolical, no, how do you say it? Like mystic, diabolical sexuality, and was kind of a mystic strong. And then in the 1930s, when Husen was in the cinema more, it was the African man was this kind of dumb nephew character, and the German colonialists were the good uncles, and it was all kind of a jolly relationship. And Mohamed Husen, maybe through his physicality, rather small guy, fit into this view. And so there was really a change, and he was really kind of desexualized, is that a word, in his movie roles. But obviously the German women found him very interesting. I don't know, so
I mean, I find your question really interesting because obviously, you know, being a female camera person facing off against him, filming him, and then kind of going on the traces of where he filmed, and particularly when I was filming in Algeria as a you know, one-person crew, being a female, it kind of really brought home to me all of the complexities of what that would have meant even back in the 1950s when he had been there with a camera. But I just think that sometimes what complicates this question is when you filter it through the prism of socialism, because it's absolutely not the same experience, I think, as viewed from a Western perspective. Because within the socialist project in Yugoslavia, which was very much a modernist project, patriarchy was absolutely seen as belonging to this vertical of capitalism, imperialism, and so on. And so, for example, the Anti-Fascist Front of Women was one of the largest and most important political organizations in Yugoslavia at the time. So just to say that sometimes it's worth bearing in mind that when you filter this question through socialist political structures, it tends to lead to different outcomes. In the case of the Yugoslav newsreels, there were women who were editors of the stories. And I don't mean physically editors, but if editors in the sense of those who wrote the voiceovers and the newsreels. So very much having more of an authorial position in the final product than he would have had as a cameraman. But it is a question that we discussed many, many times, because one of the things I did with him often, going back to Eva's strategies of reframing the material, is I would make him watch the footage with me and comment on it and try and kind of provide an alternative voiceover to the material. And we would, every time there was a female presence in his footage, whether it's one of the female combatants in the Algerian Liberation Army, or it's women who were members of the press corps at the United Nations General Assembly, we would stop the image and discuss that actually. What is the role of women and where were the women? And, you know, how much technological advances in the material that we carry have affected their ability to be present in the field, even, which for me never felt like a very convincing argument, but it was there.
I'd like to add something, Bettina.
Okay,
on race.
We have 2 minutes, but go ahead, and then I have one more. Yeah.
I mean, the crazy thing about race is that basically they were experiencing racism all the time when they were in Moscow, and they stood out. So two of the students' films that we were surfaced were about confronting Russian society with Africa and their perceptions of Africa. One is Suleiman Ibrahim Nour's film called Africa, and the other is earlier generation Costa Dian's film called The Dance of the Masks. The second thing is that they had to film exercises throughout the years of being at the VGIG. And sometimes they needed to cast roles. And the only person available or who was willing to play a role was a friend who was also African. So they play cavalrymen in the Russian army, in the so-called Russian army. Or there was an adaptation The Killers, the short story by Hemingway, which became a film many, many times. And the characters are black skinned, but they don't represent an African. So there was this like race and skin color appear in different and contradicting ways in the films.
That's very interesting. And I think that we haven't really gotten to discuss race. The last question, or maybe a thought, something that was a question that I'll turn into a provocation that we can end with, aside from maybe some of the things you didn't answer, which were the practical questions around archives. Maybe you can chat with those people, after. But what Hanky asked, she's the wonderful person who's assisting us behind the scenes today. She asked, does the physicality of film, Mila kept emphasizing it was 35 millimeter that was shot and that is housed in the archive, which is, if you work with film, this is very different to 16 and 8 millimeter. And we understand also that the weight of particular cameras at particular times changes how easy they are to operate in the field and who might be operating them, and Hanky asks, does this physicality actually allow for a different kind of collaboration with history? And I thought this was a really interesting question, and she goes back to Mpo's work, which is about these double exposure roles, double exposures of these white personal archives in relation to land in the context in which he's working as a collaboration. And I guess it's really interesting to think of all of your gestures to the archive as kinds of collaboration or reaching out for collaboration, which maybe doesn't always get returned in a sense. And sort of, I guess also to note that, all of us occupy particular racial positions in relation to that archive, and we're kind of, figuring out our kind of image within the shadow maybe as well. So I think we can end there. Thank you very much. Trying to keep time, it's not very easy. And sorry, we started a little late. We'll break for lunch and we'll see everybody later. Wonderful panel, thank you.